The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother. Proverbs 1, 7 and 8. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Gap Fillers Podcast, episode number 18. My name is Michael Bradford, and let's get started here. First, I actually want to give a shout out to all the mothers out there, and particularly the best mother, mine. Happy Mother's Day, and I hope y'all are spoiled this week. Y'all deserve it, especially the good ones out there, like mine. I'll never... I'll always be grateful for all the sacrifices that she made for me growing up and keeping me in line. Lord knows I was a handful at times, but she's a loving mother, and I love her for that. All right, so let's get into a little bit of news this week. Let's see here. All right, so State Senator Jay Pizzo is officially running for governor. This was no surprise after he left the Democrat Party, so it's looking like he's going to make a run for it as an independent. Now, this is interesting because usually, this has happened once before with Charlie Crist, where somebody gets disassociated from their party and runs as an independent, but is basically backed by the opposition party. Both times this was a Democrat kind of opposition, because it's been a long while since there's been a Democrat governor in Florida. I think it was the early 90s, the last time there was one. Don't hold me to that. But the other thing is Casey DeSantis is a little bit hung up on some scandals, but that's she's way behind in the polls, behind Byron Donalds. Byron Donalds has the support of DeSantis in the run for governor of Florida, and it's really looking like he's in the lead right now. But there's a whole year and a half to go before the election, and people don't even start thinking about that election for another year. But for some reason, this one's starting off early, especially with Byron Donalds, which is interesting. I think it might have been Trump trying to get ahead of DeSantis and Casey DeSantis trying to run. But there's been some scandal with her with something called the Hope Florida, which is her nonprofit. She heads up that nonprofit. And it was there's been some allegations that she was diverting Medicaid settlements kind of into her charity, and then it basically allows her to kind of pad her pockets, maybe not in the sense of actually personal pockets, but it all kind of reeks of corruption. And while I'm a huge supporter, I largely support of what Ron DeSantis has done for governor, as governor, there's been a few things. I've talked about that before in earlier podcasts, primarily his FWC pitch and his environmental or conservation platform. I really haven't. There's not him pushing back against Disney on the cultural side. It was about time that somebody in Florida had the balls to stand up to him for that. And that I'm grateful for him. And he had largely the correct instincts when it came to COVID, but this is no guarantee on why we should vote for his wife. She mother, breast cancer survivor, but at the end of the day, she's not a politician, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's no core group, core set of principles behind her, or proven principles behind her, like Byron Donalds. Byron Donalds has made headlines and pushing back against Biden. Primarily last year, a lot of it was. And while Trump's endorsement is huge for him, I don't necessarily have, carry much weight with Trump's personal endorsement. He's endorsed several terrible candidates. I can't, like, absolute garbage, like Mike Rogers in Michigan. Just some, it all the way back into his first term. There were some senator, some people that were really just terrible pits. There was one from Alabama. I forget his name. It was to replace his secretary of one of his secretary pits. I can't remember back that far, but I remember that was a terrible pick, which lost Alabama for a while. So there's just while Trump's I like Trump this time around. And this is kind of like his villain arc for those Gen Z people out there. Where he basically is has done a shift in political and his political views over the past year and a half really. There's not really much that I would support Casey with over Byron. I like Byron before he was way before he was endorsed by DeSantis. I thought he would have been a good pick, so I have no problem with that. I think Perez is going to run for a seat. I'm not sure where that left to be. And that Speaker Perez is term limited, so he's either going to run for a Senate seat, a state Senate seat, or run for maybe governor. It's kind of what I'm thinking, because he keeps on challenging DeSantis on several different things. And that brings me to this next topic. The Florida legislature goes back to session when they should have been out of session already. They're adding another 3 weeks to their first session in order to get their constitutionally mandated balanced budget approved. This is one of the latest times that they've actually gone to ratify to ratify the balanced budget. Usually Florida's pretty good about that, but this is kind of an odd time. I talked about that last week. I won't get into that too much, but really this week it come down to DeSantis wants property tax cuts, and Perez is aiming for sales tax cuts. Now, Florida sales, the Florida property tax it would be a little bit different, because it would be more local municipalities aimed at, and then the state sales tax currently sits at 6%, and Perez, the Perez solution would lower it to 5.25%. Which would constitute one of the largest tax decreases in state history. This would be I like both ideas are good. I'm in favor of lowering taxes around the board. I view taxation generally as theft. Actually, no, it is theft. The problem is that the government doesn't think of any way else to fund themselves but through taxation. And that's where I've proposed in previous podcasts. I might cover more in the future, like sovereign wealth funds. You might set up a 401k for the government to be funded through. Just use excesses. But property taxes are way more draconian than sales taxes, especially with the current industry in Florida being tourism. A lot of that is something that we can kind of afford. Now, when it comes to property taxes, this will help everyone. I think they should aim their property tax relief if they do end up doing property tax relief. I think residential homes, agricultural land, stuff like that should be aimed at first. Stuff that are industries that are struggling. The condo industry is not struggling. The landlord, the rental industry is not struggling. The hotel industry is not struggling. Go down the line and I know that sounds kind of pick winners and losers, and to a certain extent that is, but the tourist industry in Florida is way too large currently. and it leaves Florida vulnerable, and because it's more of an excess purchase. People go on vacations in excess. They don't go, or run into debt. But all in all, if somebody loses their job, they're not going to go buy, Disney tickets. At least they shouldn't. So that's where that comes into that line of thinking. It would help the people who have moved to Florida, in rural Florida. It would help them in ways that places like Orlando and Miami and Clearwater kind of don't need. Jacksonville and Tampa Bay area. They would be helped by property tax relief, because those are less tourist industries and more old, physical industries. A lot of trade comes in through those, primarily because they're port cities. And Miami is a port city, but much of what comes into Miami stays in Miami. It goes up the 95 and down south corridor. But a lot of what comes in through Jacksonville kind of disperses throughout the state. Same with Panama City kind of area. Now that's kind of like a mixed bag, but Tampa Bay is the other huge one. And if you relieve the property tax relief in there, it'll allow the state to kind of consolidate more physical hard industry, and that's my view on that. But like I said, both are good proposals. I like that. There's a kind of competition of ideas now, on a good side, as opposed to socialism versus communism. Lackluster Republicans in the federal Congress, as opposed to socialism. Where the federal government legislature is failing. Florida kind of has the opposite, because it's too big of a majority to kind of maneuver. I really endorse DeSantis's proposal for property tax relief over Perez's. I won't be disappointed, extremely disappointed, if Perez gets his through. But that's the major thing that is going to be happening in the legislature for the next few weeks. They have till June 6th in order to pass a budget. That's the official end of the session, the extended session rather. And they'll hammer it out. There'll probably be some kind of compromise, maybe a less of a property or sales tax relief, but who knows? Politicians kind of, it's like, a lot of politics, it's like playing poker, where, people try to hold their cards close to the chest and don't try not to reveal what their true motive is. And, we'll see. It's Trump is the kind of the master at that currently. But he says the quiet parts out loud, but then kind of has a people accuse it of being like 3D chess or 4D chess. And it's just regular chess. It's moves and counter moves, and mixed with a little poker, bluffing and all that stuff. Which kind of brings me into my next point. There's been a couple trade deals announced this week. The UK has signed a trade deal with the US, and recently, just actually this afternoon, this Sunday, there has been a report that China has signed has agreed to at least the preliminary outlines of a trade deal. So I expect the market to be up tomorrow. That'll be nice. Now, people are sweating, and politically they're kind of freaking out. It behooves an opposition party to freak out whenever whenever something happens, even though it was kind of predicted. I'm a free market guy for the most part, but I don't believe that you can have a permanent trade deficit with everybody. People like to use the trade deficit. I have a trade deficit with my dry cleaners. Yes, but you don't have a trade deficit with everybody else. combined. You have a net income. Now that ends up being a little different because you're producing products and all that fun stuff. But at the end of the day, you have capital outflows versus capital inflows. The trade deficit actually does allow the government to run a deficit without inflation. It's kind of a trick of fiat currency. If you have a dollar, if you're making dollars and you have dollar outflows, more dollar outflows than you have inflows, then you can print more money without a necessary inflationary spiral. Now, if China wants to dump dollars, they can cause an inflationary spiral that way. However, that will also cause the yen to be deflationary, and that hurts them on their trade. So they're kind of intertwined. They're kind of stuck in a way. Depends completely on how much they want to hurt themselves. It's odd how that works because a weaker currency has the upper hand when it comes to bringing in more trade, or a current trade at current trade levels because of how currency contracts and all that stuff. It's a very complicated thing, but we actually saw that in history when the Spanish basically had slave labor in Peru with the silver mines and Bolivia and all that stuff. They actually flooded so much silver into the European market, it caused inflation on the silver-based economy. A lot of currencies back then were based on silver or gold, mostly silver, and it caused an inflationary spiral because the value of silver dropped, which makes the value of their currency drop, which makes the prices per silver. So say a bushel of wheat rises from $1 to $1.25 in silver because of that. So that's a very interesting trade dynamic, and it'll be interesting to see what the deals come out to be. Basically, one thing we got out of the UK is buying more of our agricultural product, which is mostly our largest export. Is because one of the reasons is because Europe can't feed itself. They freak out because of population density, but that's because they can't feed themselves. And they depend heavily on the Ukraine and on the U.S. to sustain, to kind of supplement their markets. Now they could technically feed themselves in some form or fashion for a long while, but they don't have a net balance between food and population. And so. And in return, the U.S. has agreed to lower tariffs on UK-made vehicles, like Land Rovers, Jaguars, that kind of vehicle, which ends up being more luxury type. Most of the vehicles in Europe, besides Volkswagen, are luxury. Very few are not. Fiat is kind of a faux. It's a luxury car in some way. We don't buy a lot of Fiat, or you don't see a lot of Fiat in America. Now Fiat owns somebody else. I forget who. They bought like Jeep or something like that back in the day. So it's an odd thing. But I think for the most part, a lot of it's a broad global market on a lot of product. But the UK builds a lot of their luxury cars. So so there, that's become a trade agreement. A lot more in the works on that. But we'll see. The China one is the biggest one. The last topic I do want to focus on is one that a lot of the wider legacy media has not focused on at all, which is the Pakistan-India conflict. There's been a big problem for over 80 years now between India and Pakistan. They were all part of the former British Raj, which is the India when the UK, or back in the day they would refer to India or the British Raj. That's all referring to Pakistan and India and Bangladesh for that matter. Burma was kind of in that. It was a little bit different though. Anyways, so during the consolidation of the British Raj during the late 1800s, especially. It was combined under a UK form of government that had it was kind of like a loose confederation, because before the British Raj became a thing, India was a bunch of independent kingdoms, and Pakistan, all the regions were kind of splintered, and not a united centralized government. And basically, the way the British were able to take over is they were able to pin everybody against themselves, use the hate of the British, or the Hindu versus the Muslim kind of dynamic, in Bangladesh and Pakistan versus India, what is now India, and then they were basically able to consolidate their power underneath one single unified government. That happened a lot post 1776 and pre World War One, kind of like within the 19th century. So a lot of that after in 1948 is when the British Raj was giving independence, and there was a two-state solution. And Pakistan actually stands for it's like an acronym for what they for the districts that kind of seceded from. It's a weird thing. It's its own odd thing why they're called Pakistan. And then India is primarily Hindu, and Bangladesh was called East Pakistan, and they all went to fighting immediately, pretty much, because you had people fighting over Kashmir, rushing. One of the largest human migrations of all time happened during that time, because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the border, because Hindus don't like Muslims and Muslims don't like Hindus, and so in doing so, they were fleeing kind of what was going to be persecution. So that all kind of led into that. India developed a nuke in the 70s, 80s kind of time frame, and then the Pakistanis developed one in the late 90s. They both have 150 newts each, pretty much low yield, which means they're kind of between slightly smaller than the Hiroshima bomb to slightly larger than the Hiroshima bomb. Kind of in that time little frame of reference. They're not huge nukes, but they would still be enough to drastically, basically, wipe anybody out, that they needed to. That's the benefit of nukes, is they basically can blow up an entire city, at least a few square blocks, and anyways, so. They fought several different conflicts between 3 and 4 since Pakistan India separation, and this is just the most recent one. It started with several different a terror group out of Pakistan, so to speak. Whether they were paramilitary or military or just a splinter group. Pakistan is where Bin Laden was found, so they obviously still have a problem with newts, not newts, terrorism in some way or form or fashion, and they killed some Hindu tourists in Kashmir. Kashmir is the primary place for conflict between these two states. Primarily because one views it as entirely theirs, and the other obviously doesn't. Is the exact opposite. And then you have China, which is the wild card in the region. India vastly outnumbers Pakistan by like 6-1. 1.2 billion versus 200 million. However, China backs Pakistan. It would back Pakistan in a general conflict in order to weaken India, which is their regional competitor, especially when it comes to trade, because the GDP per capita now in China is more than India, and India has been trying to pull itself out. They had a heavily nationalist government, socialist nationalist, so to speak, ironically enough, in India during a lot of the 20th century. So that became an issue for them. They kind of they failed to take off, pretty much. Now they were able to develop a little bit of technology as referenced by the nukes, but overall they've remained generally backward. With a lot of it has to do with their culture, as I talk about a lot in this podcast. A culture kind of defines how a country interacts, and can only be changed so much before you end up with a disunited government, and you end up with or disjointed government rather, and because or disjointed culture, and so that all becomes a huge issue. So anyways, basically, so India basically launched several different isolated strikes against what they viewed as terrorist camps. Pakistan obviously couldn't stand that, so in order to save face, they shot down 5 military aircraft from India, and then started to lob artillery shells. Supposedly, this has not been confirmed by a lot of sources, but they were exchanging isolated attacks, and were kind of gearing up for a mobilization of troops. India obviously has the industrial and manpower advantage, but Pakistan is very martialistic. They're run and operated by their government or by their army. The army general has deposed several different presidents or prime ministers of Pakistan. In fact, it's more likely that a prime minister is likely to be removed from office by the army, the head general of the army, as opposed to actually being voted out. So more often than not, the army basically has control of Pakistan, which keeps it relatively in line, especially compared to its neighbors, Iran and Afghanistan. So it ends up being a sort of a military state. And so in order to save face, they have to strike India back. And India, if they strike too hard, India can't save face either. So, that's the general idea of the conflict. I'll save all the jokes for the memes and for ats. I might post a couple on ats, but overall, the idea is the major risk to the U.S. Is trade with India, especially Pakistan with terrorist groups. Last thing we need is another failed state in Muslim-backed areas, especially adjacent to Iran. It gives Iran more influence in the region. And the way that Trump was able to get them to the table is basically agreed to trade with both of them more, which they both kind of agreed to. Now that's a dangerous precedent to set, especially if you're in the middle of a trade war with the entire world. If China wants more out of the U.S., they can threaten Taiwan, and Taiwan can threaten China or whatever, and basically they both can get more trade out of the U.S. if that you can do that pretty much around the world at that point. With somebody doesn't like somebody else, and in order to save the U.S. from being flooded by refugees from India and causing great or possibly blowing up the world. Now, India and Pakistan don't have enough nukes to do that, but they can supposedly lower the atmosphere with a small nuclear winter, which could cause major crop failures and cause widespread starvation and major I can't get that word out of my mouth. Destabilize the a lot of the world governments and stuff like that. So, that was the major fear. Not that India and Pakistan, we have a close military relationship like we do with NATO or Israel, which is probably why the legacy media didn't cover it as much. But at the end of the day, I think it had greater impact if India and Pakistan went to war than Israel and Gaza or Ukraine and Russia, for the primary reason as it's a quarter of the world's population. That would be the biggest, and then it could possibly pull in China. So the last thing I want to talk about here is the Charlie Kirk event I was invited to yesterday, Saturday. I was able to attend an event called Florida Family Voice, their banquet, and the keynote speaker was Charlie Kirk. I'm always weary about seeing people or talking, listening to people talk politics. Usually it's a lot of platitudes and not very strong wording. Or, it's kind of, yeah, freedom and yeah, very vague, useless terminology, kind of to pat themselves on the back, but not really take a stand. I was actually fairly impressed with Charlie Kirk. Leaned a lot into churches and why churches aren't doing the right thing and having the correct influence on culture. He basically divided everybody, the church, into two camps. And it ended up being kind of like a 10-80-10 rule, right? You got 10% of churches that are heavily supportive and doing the right thing and charging forward and influencing culture in the correct way. And then you have 80%, he called the tremblers, which I think was probably a good term for them, which they're so concerned about losing their 501c3 status or they're offending somebody that doesn't agree with them politically. Now, you don't have to agree with somebody's tax policy in order to get along with them, which especially at church, and I agree with. But at moral issues especially, the church needs to take a stand primarily on those issues, and 80% of churches aren't. And then you got 10%, the other 10%, which are wholly pro immoral, culture, abortion to trans to gay, everything. And so you end up with that kind of problem, and Charlie Kirk really laid into him. It was kind of in a very non-ecumenical way, or ecumenical way. He was basically saying, "Get your act together," which I 100% agree. He could be preaching a tent revival for political tent revival for churches and pastors. I'm glad to say that my pastor of the church I go to is strong and not willing to let any opportunity go by to influence the city of Orlando for Christ. And for that, I hold him. I never felt one piece of guilt towards, oh man, he's talking to about my pastors or somebody else. So I love the fact that my church does that, but it's often referenced that he reaches out to other pastors in Orlando and, oh, well, we can't do that. Oh, we're too busy, and like I've said before, laws don't affect culture, or laws don't affect society as much as culture by a long shot. However, if you have laws that are anti-cultural and antithetical to a society that espouses Christ and basically is cohesive, then you have a problem, especially. And a lot of churches have abandoned that. He talked about the church business model programs that people have done, and basically turned them into businesses, and in doing so have neutered them. So I was very happy to watch him, but. Yeah, on that note, I hope you all have a good week. Thank you for joining me. If you want to support the podcast, you can follow me on X, subscribe on YouTube or Spotify. That helps bring my reach out a little bit farther, especially YouTube. YouTube's algorithm is generally more favoritive to listing newer streams. Spotify's a little odd with the way their algorithm works, but follow me on X, follow my page, Florida Gap Fillers on Facebook. On X, it would be at GapFillers1776. I appreciate y'all joining with me, and if you like to help spread the word, that'd be awesome. Thank you, and have a good week.